who's been organising these meetings are very much of that belief as well, that we need to make a better world, we need to change things. This session, which is the 1950s and gay liberation, was opened by Colin Wilson, who is in socialist and LGBT politics for almost 40 years. He campaigned against Clause 28, which he might explain, or we can take that up in discussion. Was an organizer for lesbians and gays against Hitler during the Minority Strike. He was active in a variety of trade union LGBT campaigns as well, and is currently writing a book on capitalism and the history of gender and sexuality.
Okay, thank you. The gay liberation movement, as it was called, began in June 1969 in New York, not with a march or with a conference, but with a riot. And I'll talk about the Stonewall riot and the movement that came out of it in both Britain and America. But before I do that, I want to provide some context for Stonewall and for those movements, to explain something about how they developed and what they were rebelling against. And as we go along, I want to challenge some widely accepted myths about LGBT history. And I think one of the great myths is that this is a story about slow but continuous progress away from Victorian prejudice. Let's assume that we start in the Victorian period, and over time we get an advance of which, gay marriage and so on is the final culmination. And it's not that that story is completely untrue. All sex between men was made illegal in Britain in 1885. It was partly decriminalised in 1967, and I'll talk about that. It was the case, for example, I don't know if this is surprising to the younger members of the audience, that certainly in my lifetime you could be sacked for being gay. That is later the 1980s, if a woman got divorced and it became clear she was a lesbian, she would lose custody of her children. There was all this stuff that doesn't happen now. But the 67 Act wasn't some kind of simple halfway point. And it isn't the case either that after the very exciting events we're going to talk about this evening, that things just kept on getting better. I don't know if people are familiar with the AIDS quilt. You see there, these panels, they're each of them 3 foot by 6 foot. On the right you see some of the panels laid out in Washington, D.C. There are now 49,000 panels in the AIDS Memorial Quilt, and that reflects a tiny part of the number of people who died of AIDS in the 1980s. So in New York City, you might know that around 3,000 people died in 9/11, but over 100,000 people have died of AIDS. Many of them gay men, a lot of them also people of colour, IV drug users. Nationally in the States, 658,000 people have died of AIDS, which is over 11 times the number of Americans who died in Vietnam. And the response of the American government to this, of Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, was that he did not make a major speech about AIDS until 87. By that time, 20,000 people were dead. He did not speak at that point. He did not speak until that point. And in various ways, the government's willful neglect led to the deaths of thousands of gay men. So we're not, as I say, talking about some kind of steady progress from things being bad to things being better. It's more complicated than that. I think really what gay liberation was about rejecting the kind of society that existed in the 50s and 60s. So really what I want is to start off by trying to give some impression of what that was like. But again, it's simply not the case that things had always been as oppressive as they were in the 50s. If you look at the 20s and 30s, there are actually real pockets of acceptance. In particular, in places like Harlem, there were many millions of African Americans. At the start of the century, most black people in the States lived in the South doing agricultural work. As that came to be mechanized, they were thrown off the land, started moving to the north. In places like Harlem, you had huge drag balls. You had Gladys Bentley on the left there, who performed in clothes associated with men, who flirted with women in the audience. You have this whole acceptance of gay people in that community. So this brings us to our second myth, which is that it's educated white middle class people we have to thank for spreading enlightenment to the backward masses, because that's not the case either. What you do get in the 50s and 60s, I would argue, is a conscious effort by the rulers of America to recreate society after the war on their terms. So, for example, that involves smashing the Communist Party, the organised left, the unions. So you have the McCarthy witch hunts in which over 10,000 people lose their jobs. You have the judicial murder of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who are accused of being communist spies. They go to the electric chair. But part of the witch hunts as well was that people accused of being homosexuals were banned from working for the federal government, and actually more lesbians and gay men lost their jobs than did communists, tens of thousands. And there was a whole range of oppressive practices. For example, lesbians and gay men were sent to psychiatric hospitals. In at least one hospital, brain surgery was performed. Gay sex was illegal in most states. In California, there was a 15-year sentence for oral sex. That's for straight oral sex as well as gay oral sex. Cops raided gay bars. All gay bars lost their licenses and therefore were closed down that way. And you read, for example, the black lesbian author Audre Lorde. She talks about living in Manhattan in the 1950s. You would go to a bar, the bar would be closed down, word would go round about a new bar, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what it was like. And what the American ruling class wanted to create was a society that I think was typified by the growth of the suburbs. And the suburbs had been expanding since the end of the 19th century. But there was this idea that this would have been families with mom, dad, and two kids. There were no grandparents there were no lodgers. There were these clearly defined gender roles where the man goes out to work after he comes out of the army. Where he goes out to work, he provides for the family, the woman stays at home with her washing powder, caring for the house and the kids, and so on and so forth. And one element of this was a huge level of consumerism, cars and fridges and washing machines and so on, which in some ways people really wanted because they'd been through World War II, they'd been through the Depression. This was in many ways a better life. But it was also a very conformist life. So there were these places called Levittown. There were several Levittowns that were built by the Levitt Company. There's a picture of one on the right, which gives you the impression of that conformity. On the left, there are four kinds of houses. You could have one of four houses in Levittown, and so that's, and so that's what it was like. And the suburbs excluded people, both on the basis of sexuality and on the basis of race. So there was a Levittown in Long Island, which by 1960 had 82,000 inhabitants, of whom not a single one was black. The company's policy was openly that black people couldn't live there. The American state also subsidized suburban development in discriminatory ways. So you could get cheaper government-backed mortgages. There were billions of dollars spent on this, but you couldn't get one if you came from an area which was judged a bad risk. And black people came from those areas. So it was a way of excluding
African Americans from the suburbs, without actually saying so. This was called redlining. The red areas were the African American areas. If you'd been in the armed forces, there was passed, I think, in '44, the GI Bill, which included various benefits. You could get free education, you could get home loans. The administrators of the GI Bill were often racist and excluded black people. But you were also excluded from the provisions of the GI Bill if you'd been kicked out of the service. If you had what was called an undesirable discharge. Now, this isn't a dishonourable discharge where you've been court-martialed, where there's been a legal process and you've been found to have done something. You just get one of these. They decide that they don't really like you, and they just want you gone. So they don't have to prove anything. You don't get lawyers or any chance to defend yourself. And so if you had one of these, you couldn't get the government-backed mortgage. You were excluded from the suburbs, and LGBT people were excluded from the suburbs anyway, because the suburbs were single-family housing. That's almost all that existed there. So what you have here is the deliberate construction by the American state in the 50s and 60s of a homophobic society in terms of housing, in terms of jobs, in terms of police harassment, and this is part of a broader picture of racism, sexism, smashing the left. And this really brings us to the third and final myth that I guess I want to challenge, which is this idea that there's a kind of separate LGBT politics, there's a separate LGBT history from all of these other issues. It's all, I think, part of the same picture. And also, you have these connections between LGBT people and gender and race and class politics and so on, in terms of how people organised to fight back. So, for example, in 1951, there was established one of the first gay organisations called the Mattachine Society by a guy called Harry Hay. He had been a member of the Communist Party, and he took a left-wing approach to the topic. He argued that homosexuals were, as he put it, an oppressed cultural minority, and he started to organise Mattachine using a cell structure, which was how the Communist Party organised. When McCarthy became active, Mattachine moved to the right, and Hay was kicked out, but still you have that link. The other link that I think you see between LGBT issues and broader politics was struggles around race. So this is the point at which the civil rights movement is becoming active around racism in the South. People will know there was segregation on buses and restaurants and schools and so on. The movement begins in '55 with the Montgomery bus boycott. By 1967, those laws had mostly gone. The last of them to go was the law which existed in 30 states until 1967, which were laws against black and white people marrying. And you then have a change in focus in terms of anti-racist struggle towards the North, towards more militant struggles, because the people who have come to the North don't face the kind of apartheid that you have in the South, but they still have worse jobs, worse housing, and so on. So you start to get a more radical movement which demands that the whole of America has to change. It's not just the South, it's not just formal equality before the law, but which is also characterised by black people taking action in their own defence of what's called black power. And from 1965, the photo on the right is from the event called the Watts Riot or the Watts Rebellion. This is from an African-American area of LA, where people fought back against police harassment. Over 30,000 people took part in that. And there was further rioting in 1968 on a huge scale after Martin Luther King
was assassinated. There were 20,000 people in Washington, D.C. alone for the cops and the army. So there is this kind of background going on, and there is this general militancy. By 68, of course, there was also the movement around the Vietnam War, there was the movement around women's liberation, and what you see is the most militant gay people are starting to echo the kind of struggles that black people are waging. So you know that one of the struggles in the South was to get service at lunch counters. What was happening in New York City was that gay men were regularly refused service in bars. So what you have here is some campaigners went into a bar, took the news photographers with them, and asked for service, and they got service, but then said they were homosexual. So this is why the barman is putting his hand, you see, onto the glass, because he's about to serve them beer, but has now discovered they're gay, so he can't because it would be against the law. So you see that. You see the first riots on a smaller scale than Stonewall, but still, in '66. This is in the Tenderloin, which is a rough area of San Francisco. There was a bunch of trans people, sex workers, disreputable people, not respectable people, used to hang out at a place called Compton's Cafeteria. The owners wanted them to leave, the cops were sent for, and fighting started. So the first small signs that people were getting sick of the kind of oppression they were facing, you see there, and also you have in the Tenderloin as well, you see the idea developing that gay activists would apply for funding to improve the area, and referring to it as a kind of ghetto. So again, they're making the comparison and arguably appropriating the term from the black struggle. And finally, in '68, you have gay organisations endorsing the slogan, "Gay is good." This is before Stonewall. It became a big slogan of the movement, which clearly echoes the slogan, "Black is beautiful." The person who put that forward was Frank Kameny, who deserves to be remembered, who was a leading light in the movement for many decades. I also think it's really important to mention two other people. James Baldwin was a novelist, essayist, civil rights activist, was about as openly gay as you could be in the 50s and 60s, wrote a novel called Giovanni's Room on gay themes in '56. In 1962, he wrote a novel called Another Country. I cannot recommend that highly enough that people read Another Country. It's an extraordinary book. It's over 50 years old, and yet it deals with issues around race, with issues around sexuality. It has black and white characters, it has gay characters, straight characters, bi characters. This is, as I say, over 50 years ago. It's extraordinary. So we should remember Baldwin, and we should remember Ruskin, who was one of the main organisers for the March on Washington in '63. In 10 years before, in '53, he'd spent 60 days in jail after he was caught having sex with two other men in a parked car. And he worked with Martin Luther King until 1960, when he was pressured by a leading black preacher into resigning from work with King, but then he came back in '63 and as I say, was involved in organising the March on Washington. So there's this radicalism building. Before we look at how that led to the riot, we need to look at what was happening in Britain. Where, as I say, all sex between men have been illegal since 1885. Sex between women wasn't as such illegal, but lesbians faced very much the same discrimination. There was a lesbian novel called The Well of Loneliness, for example, which was, you can tell from the fact that it's called The Well of Loneliness, and it's not really a cheerful novel. It was banned as obscene. The furthest that the book gets towards obscenity is the words, "All that night they were not divided,"
which, you know, by modern standards is tame. But anyway, so I mean, that's what had been happening in Britain. There was this long tradition of oppression. I want to read something. This is from the 70s, after the movement started, and it's this personal thing that gives you an idea of what things could be like. In loving memory of Mr. Day, who took his life in May 1938, aged 19 years. We kissed in the park and they caught us. I got 9 months, he died. He used to say, we'll make it together. It's been a long time, though, and a lonely journey. I wish I could say we'll meet again, but I have no faith, only memories, Harry. May I pay tribute to all those who suffered and died with us during the dark years. And that's in 38. That's before the war. After the war, things actually got worse. There was a huge rise in levels of prosecution. So in this graph, I don't know if you can see the different offences prosecuted. The black bar is 38 and the pink bars are 54 to 5. So there was this huge increase in the level of prosecutions. This was the period when people will have heard perhaps of Alan Turing, who was hounded to his death. And by the time the law was changed, 1 prisoner in 25 was in jail for gay sex. This is, you know, an extraordinary thing to think about now. The authorities began to worry that this was, that they didn't really need to go this far, or it was embarrassing, or it made them look stupid, and there were respectable people were periodically jailed. Lord Montague of Bewley, anyone remember the lines of Longleat? That was Lord Montague Bewley. Lord Montague Bewley, Peter Wildflood, who was a diplomatic correspondent on the Daily Mail. Mail. Equally relevant. Was jailed, as you see, for 12 or 18 months, and Wildflood then wrote a book calling for the law to be changed. And there was actually a government commission recommended partial decriminalisation, and there was then a 10-year campaign to get that put into practice. It was a very nervous and respectable campaign. It was fronted by doctors and vicars and magistrates. There were lots of gay people involved, of course, but they all remained closeted. They didn't actually say that they were gay. There was lots of behind-the-scenes lobbying and so on. You know, sort of trying to get MPs to change the law, but not doing anything public. There was nothing like a march. That was unthinkable. Things were a bit better in the northwest of England. You see, they actually had campaigns, or they actually had public meetings with, you know, the Dean of Manchester, the very Reverend Alfred Jowett. That's the tone of it. But there's this guy, Alan Horsfall, who was another person who deserves to be remembered. Horsfall was the leader of the campaign in the northwest. He was a pit deputy, which is to say he was a sort of lower manager in the pits. He lived in a National Coal Board house. And what's interesting is that he said that he didn't get any shit. He didn't get any shit off the coal board, but he also didn't get any shit off the miners. And so, you know, this is again this idea that, that sort of ordinary working class people might be a bit backwards. Not the case at all. So that's what Horsfall was doing. And eventually, after 10 years of campaigning, gay sex was kind of decriminalised a bit. The slogan, or the summary, shall we say,
of the 67 Act was that gay sex became legal between two consenting adults in private. Every word mattered. There had to be two people, two at the most. There was a maximum 2 years jail for involving a third man in anal sex. This is all men, remember. Women, sex between women haven't ever been illegal, except in the army. Had to be between consenting adults. Adults were defined as over 21, because teenagers can be seduced and perverted and so on and so forth. They are vulnerable. So there was 5 years if a man over 21 had sex with a man under 21. I mean, how would you know? And I would say this was still the case. This was still the case until the 90s. I mean, when I was at university and was having sex, it was against the law. And it had to be in private. It had to be in a room with the door locked, specifically not in a public toilet, even if the people involved were in a cubicle, which was often not in a hotel because somebody might walk in and then that wouldn't be private. It didn't apply to straight people, so there was still a life sentence for a man who had anal sex with a woman, which had been the case since the 16th century. It didn't apply to Scotland or the 6 counties of the north of Ireland. And it didn't apply in the armed forces or the merchant navy. So it's a very dubious kind of advance. It's better than nothing. People took a bit of confidence from it. People weren't jailed. Well, according to historian Geoffrey Weeks, actually more people were jailed after 67 than before, but it improved things a bit. I mean, people got blackmailed a lot as well as jailed. But you get some of the tone of the 67 Act. If you look at Lord Arran, who proposed it, and who said, any form of ostentatious behaviour, any form of public flaunting would be, you all have to behave yourself, boys, and not let Lord Arran down. So that was very much the kind of the sort of tone. So that's all kind of, that's nothing particularly wonderful. At the same time, this is 67, the next year in 68, you get in Paris, students take over the centre of Paris, build barricades, that's on the left, but on the right, it's not just students, it's also workers. The biggest general strike in history up to that point. Those are the workers having a mass meeting in the car factory at Billancourt. And so now you have the radicalisation on both sides of the Atlantic, and we can actually talk about the riot. This is the good bit, I like. So, on the 27th of June 1969, the cops raided a bar called the Stonewall in Greenwich Village in New York. It didn't have a licence, it was a gay bar, and so it was run by the mob. Bar raids were fairly regular, so if you didn't have if you had a steady job, you wouldn't go to the bars, and that meant that Stonewall clientele was young people, people of colour, drag queens, butch lesbians, people selling sex, and so on. People like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who had lived on the street, who would sell sex, who were trans women or drag queens, depending on what term you feel is appropriate. People like Stormy DeLavery, who was a butch lesbian, also a woman of colour. So anyhow, the cops turn up, and they start loading people into vans. A crowd gathers. People start abusing the cops. A butch lesbian woman, many people think it was Stormy DeLavery, fights back when the cops try to put her into the van. People start throwing coins, bottles, cobblestones at the cops. The cops are forced to retreat into the bar that they have just raided. The crowd fetches petrol, and sets the bar on fire with the cops inside. The cops get reinforcements to rescue the first lot, but now a full-scale riot is happening. You've got young Puerto Rican trans people, other street people, leading charges against lines of cops. This is the first night. And the next day, graffiti has appeared calling for gay power, and the next night the rioting continues. So to quote from the historian John D'Amelio, someone heaved a sack of wet garbage through the window of a patrol car. On nearby Waverley Place, a concrete block landed on the hood of another patrol car that was quickly surrounded by dozens of men, pounding on its doors and dancing on its hood. Helmeted officers from the Tactical Patrol Force arrived on the scene and dispersed with swinging clubs an impromptu chorus line of gay men in the middle of a full kick. It was, after all, a gay riot. For the next few hours, trash fires blazed, bottles and stones flew through the air, and cries of gay power rang in the streets, as the police, numbering over 400, did battle with a crowd estimated at more than 2,000. And this was astonishing. I mean, it's like if there was rioting in an old Compton Street, now we'd be surprised. But this was a time when people had so much accepted notions of their inferiority, gay people had. You know, that there had been these meetings, these respectable meetings in England with the vicars on the platform, and so on. The idea that LGBT people could fight the cops was absolutely new, only comprehensible in the context of the broader radicalisation that was taking place in American society at the time. And so over the next few weeks, women and men in New York found an organisation called Gay Liberation Front, GLF, and they released a statement of purpose. We are a revolutionary group of men and women, formed with the realisation that complete sexual liberation for all people cannot come about unless existing social institutions are abolished. We reject society's attempt to impose sexual roles and definitions of our nature. We are creating new social forms of relations. That is, relations based upon brotherhood, cooperation, human love, and uninhibited sexuality. Babylon has forced us to commit ourselves to one thing: revolution. GLF is very much part of the broader movement of the time. The name Gay Liberation Front echoes the National Liberation Front, which was the name of the forces fighting American troops in Vietnam, what the Americans called the Viet Cong. The slogan Gay Power, of course, echoes calls for black power. And the new movement won support in return from the Black Panthers, whose history around gender and sexuality is complicated, but some of whose leaders had taken homophobic positions. So Eldridge Cleaver had attacked James Baldwin, for example. But now Huey Newton, who was the co-founder of the Panthers, argued that women and homosexuals were oppressed groups, that Panther members should, as he put it, unite with them in a revolutionary fashion. And he said that if people were unwilling to do that, were reluctant to do that, then maybe that reflected their own insecurities about gender and sexuality. GLF strongly supported women's liberation. You know, for example, when they had speakers at their events, they had both male and female spokespeople, and the movement spread across the country. Los Angeles GLF, for example, declared support for all oppressed people, and Berkeley GLF passed a resolution calling for an end to the war in Vietnam. There were further riots on a smaller scale. In August 1970, there was a march of several thousand people against bar raids, which ended in rioting. In San Francisco, there was a demo that ended in rioting. More typical of gay liberation activities was what they called ZAPs. So, for example, people would dress up as journalism students and go and visit the New York mayor's office
And once inside, they would handcuff themselves to furniture and shout gay liberation slogans. It's all quite familiar from Extinction Rebellion at the moment. It's very much the same kind of thing. They invaded medical and psychiatric conferences, they stormed the stage, gay men were running around in drag, causing havoc, and so on. They got the American Psychiatric Association to change its view that homosexuality was a mental illness. And the movement was a catalyst for other changes which weren't revolutionary, but which made a real difference. So, for example, more than half of the states which had laws against gay sex abolished them in the 1970s, and by the end of the decade, thousands of groups existed when there had only been a few dozen before Stonewall. You get traditions established such as the Pride marches. This is the first Pride march in New York City, had 5,000 to 10,000 people on it, tiny by today's standards. But really, the main change is that LGBT people came to understand that they were oppressed and that society had to change, and that it was not their fault and that they did not have to conform to society as it was. If the GLF was part of the broader movement, then they also, I think, challenged ideas on the left. The American left certainly was very dominated by Maoist ideas and Maoism, which has now faded completely, I think, away. But like all varieties of Stalinism, was typically very bad on gender and sexuality. Not that gay liberation itself was agreed on its ideas. They went off in all kinds of directions. So, for example, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera established a group called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. One of its aim was to provide housing for sex workers who were living on the street. 6 months after Stonewall, there was a breakaway in a group called Gay Activists Alliance, left GLF over a row about giving money to the Panthers. They felt that they wanted to concentrate on gay stuff, whereas GLF wanted to argue for a kind of broader revolution. There were discussions about how should meetings be organised, is having a chair and rules and people putting their hands up to speak. Isn't that part of the oppressive old order? You know, so things could get a bit chaotic. How did the movement relate to the more respectable activists who were on one occasion referred to as the doddering oldsters? Were gay men any less sexist than straight men? So, for example, after about 6 months, many women in GLF left to organise separately as lesbians. They felt that the men weren't taking their issues seriously and the men were just sexist. And there was the broader issue of whether revolutionary change is possible in America at all, and particularly after the movement began to decline in the mid-70s. You get some people really quite early on, I think in 74, 72, trying to work through the Democratic Party, though the Democratic Party is doing everything it can to keep lesbians and gay men off its platforms. So things go in all kinds of directions, and the election of Reagan really marks a kind of endpoint to all of the radicalism, but things never went back to how they were in the 50s. To finally look at gay liberation in Britain, the movement GLF was established in London in autumn 1970. By the next spring, it was attracting 400 to 500 people at meetings. There were groups in various cities, Lancaster, Leeds, and so on and so forth. Lots of these were young people, were students, were people on the dole. There was a whole movement around squatting vacant houses. There was lots of vacant property in London at the time. And people were political activists, but people also lived as part of the counterculture, and there's some kind of, and often some conflict or some difference of perspective, shall we say, between the leftists and the people who were like taking drugs and wearing different clothes and so on. Now, the leftists, I think, did that as well. Also, I'm told.
So you get the start of the tradition of pride marches. There was a march of 150 people around Highbury Fields, which was the first gay protest in Britain to protest against police harassment. There were also, GLF organised what it called people's dances. There were gay and lesbian clubs in Britain, but they were very kind of closeted, and the people who owned them policed the customers on behalf of the cops. So, for example, men could dance together, same as true of women could dance together, as long as they didn't touch each other, was the kind of rule that existed in the clubs. And the bar owners hated gay liberation. I mean, quite a lot. I mean, it's an interesting point that the historian Geoffrey Weeks makes. Quite a lot of lesbians and gay men who weren't involved in gay liberation were really quite nervous and unhappy about it because they felt that it was rocking the boat. But certainly the club owners were horrified by this. So you've got GLF protesting. There were gay clubs that wouldn't serve them, and they protested against that. But they also organised what they called people's dances. The first of these was at Kensington Town Hall, which you imagine is less posh than it is now. 700 people got in, 500 of them were turned away. And they had a series of these. One of them ended at 2 in the morning and people refused to go home and stood there shouting, "Revolution now." While the staff were saying that they wanted to go home. And you feel some sympathy with the staff. And they published, this is from the magazine called Come Together, which is a triple pun because it's also a Beatles song. They did gay days in public parks where they would just hang out and chat and kiss each other and so on. They did street theatre on protests. That's protesting about the age of consent to 21. Here's street theatre, yes. They did street theatre on protests, they had a counter-psychiatry group, they had consciousness-raising groups, which is where you get together, talk about your experience of oppression, talk about your life and relate it to political questions. One of the things that was different in Britain from America was the level of struggle in the unions and in workplaces. And for example, the miners went on strike in 72 and 74. In 74, the strike caused a crisis which brought down the government. And GLF joined the trade union demos. There was a huge one against anti-union laws. GLF were put at the back, but nonetheless they were there. They joined the demo at Pentonville Prison, where there were dockers who had been jailed under the anti-union laws. And I have this kind of ambivalent attitude to the left, as you see. And out of GLF, and this lasted, which lasted until the summer of 1972, so it's like GLF in the States, it sort of falls apart. Came a whole range of things, came support groups, phone switchboards, gay news. You must remember there's no internet at this point, people find it really hard to get in touch with the gay scene, to know where, to know where the pubs are and so on. You have the growth of a commercial scene. The Tory press is still viciously hostile. There's no support for the corporates. That was unthinkable. And the movement is being hassled by the cops the whole time. You also have, just to finish off, many of the political disagreements that you saw in the States in GLF. So the questions about who is the enemy. Is it straight people? Is it masculinity? Is it capitalism? To what extent do we need to organise for a revolution, for a workers' revolution? And so, for example, East London Gay Centre organised with the left, attempted to join as an organisation the International Socialists. And people felt workers had brought down the Tories, or workers are fighting back. That's the way forward. Or there was an attitude, which is more, I think, prevalent in South London, that we need to begin living in a new way now. That the left was too hierarchical and male, and you get groups of people, who are living communally, who are maybe squatting. There is the idea that if men wore dresses, if they wore makeup, that you could reject male power. And there are some lovely examples of defiance of the authorities. You know, somebody would get arrested for behaviour likely to cause a breach of the peace, would go to court in a sort of in a glamorous 1930s velvet gown. The judge would ask them if they always dressed like that. They would say not always, but they wanted to look their best foot forward. And so on. And so you have that. Here's a picture of some of the people living in a commune all the way. You have people setting up. It's you, Ian.
Yeah, sorry there. Don't tell them which one I am.
There was a discussion about, you know, setting up commercial things such as gay news. You know, were these people sellouts? Were they careerists? And so on. And the final thing is that, as in the States, the split happened between men and women. The women left in early '72 because they felt the men were sexist. The issues that the men faced, like the age of consent or like police harassment in public toilets, wasn't something that affected the women. But as I say, all of the stuff which exists today, all of the basics of gay community organising came out of that. So however bad it was going to get afterwards, the effect of Stonewall is something which, in countries like this, transformed utterly the lives of lesbian and gay and bi and trans people, and I think it's still absolutely something that we have to celebrate today.